Welcome to In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska, a seasoned journalist from Melbourne, Australia. This is In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska. Today we are going to look at a feature article which has been written by Professor Vankovska. Professor Vankovska is a professor at a university in Macedonia, and she writes regularly for various media outlets, as well as recently, in fact, in September of last year, she was the organizer in charge of organizing her own university's conference, international conference, something that we covered in our interviews with her. So you're welcome to check the interviews, which are conducted in English and in Macedonian separately, about that significant conference. Now, her latest contribution to the media is an article titled Rubio's Reasoning as a Reason for Optimism. A leopard cannot change its spots. And it is Professor Vankovska's own reflection to Glenn Dyson's analysis. Glenn Dyson commands well-deserved respect among scholars of international relations and security. While his work merits serious engagement, this does not oblige us to uncritically accept his conclusions. Dyson himself, I suspect, would welcome rigorous debate, a necessity in Trump's political arena, where magical thinking and performative brinkmanship often overshadow reason. Trump ascended to power on a wave of disillusionment, the dashed hopes of marginalized Americans, and the Democratic establishment's failure to inspire. Yet his campaign was a carnival of populist theatrics, mutual vilification, and hollow promises. The few voices advocating systemic change, Jill Stein and other non-electables dismissed by bipartisan media, were drowned out. Weeks into Trump's presidency, analysts still scramble to decode his erratic governance. We pass contradictory executive orders, dissect rambling speeches, and piece together shards of policy from the debris of his electoral circus. A self-styled peace president eyeing a Nobel Prize, Trump oscillates between incoherent diplomacy and reckless militarism. His administration's logorrhea and policy whiplash reveal a leader unmoored from strategy. Understandably, for those of us outside the United States, global security and the prospects for war and peace are our primary concerns. Our esteemed colleague, Professor Glenn Dyson, offered an insightful and thought-provoking analysis just a day after Secretary of State Marco Rubio's interview with Megyn Kelly on January the 30th, 2025. Dyson suggests that Rubio may have, whether intentionally or inadvertently, signaled the beginning of the end of America's hegemonic security strategy. As Dyson noted, quotation, Rubio recognized that unipolarity, having one center of power in the world, was a temporary phenomenon that has now passed. End of quote. Indeed, Rubio said that, quotation, it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was not. That was an anomaly. It was a product of the end of the Cold War, but eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, multi great powers in different parts of the planet. We were the only power, or we are in the world. And so we assume this responsibility of sort of becoming the global government in many cases, trying to solve every problem. End of quote. Dyson interprets this as a nascent acceptance of America's diminished hegemony, even suggesting cautious optimism. But as a scholar from a region scarred by the United States, quote, benevolent hegemony, end of quote, I am less sanguine. My country's identity was forcibly rewritten under Trump's first term, a NATO accession deal on name change from Macedonia to North Macedonia, brokered by Washington and Brussels, masquerading as a bilateral accord with Greece. The Macedonian public's resounding referendum rejection of this identity erasure was dismissed as, quote, Russian meddling, end of quote, as though small nations lack agency to resist geopolitical engineering. Perhaps I'm more cynical than my colleague from Norway, and understandably so, given that I come from a region that has endured the full brunt of the US self-appointed role as the world's policeman. This includes the forceful reconfiguration of the country's name and identity, ostensibly to secure NATO or NATO membership through a treaty with Greece. However, it was an open secret that this agreement was crafted not in the Balkans, but in the offices of the Brookings Institution, with Balkan leaders merely dancing to the tunes orchestrated by Washington and Brussels. Let us not forget that this identity and constitutional engineering occurred during Trump's first mandate. Determining the precise moment when unipolarity ended and multipolarity emerged is undeniably challenging. One key factor, however, was Washington's tendency to cry wolf, conjuring threats and external influences even where none existed. For instance, the fact that the Macedonian nation said clearly no to the name change treaty on a national referendum was interpreted as a, quote, result of negative Russian influence, end of quote. As if a small nation may not have brains and heart to recognize its brutal, quote, transformation, end of quote, against the people's will. Turning to Rubio's interview, some American commentators remarked, quote, interestingly, it's the first time I've ever heard Rubio speak with reasoned intelligence, end of quote. Dyson interpreted part of Rubio's remarks as an acknowledgement of the unipolar world order's demise after the Cold War and the need for the US to adapt to multipolar realities. Dyson concluded his analysis with a section titled A Reason for Optimism, suggesting that there may be a growing willingness within the White House to retire the temporary project of unipolarity. The emphasis here is on, quote, temporary, end of quote, a word that underscores the self-delusion of the US, which not only lies to itself, but also assumes that others are gullible enough to trust it after decades of hegemonic interventions since the so-called, quote, end of history, end of quote. Dyson's optimism falters under scrutiny. Rubio's interview, read in full, drips with Orwellian doublespeak. His nod to multipolarity coexists with chest-thumping exceptionalism, echoing Trump's delusion that, quote, the big stick, end of quote, still terrifies a decolonizing global majority. Radhika Desai aptly critiques this duality. In a recent public event, she said, quote, President of the United States at a time when its power was rising, Theodore Roosevelt is famous for repeating the aphorism, speak softly and carry a big stick. In the age of declining US power, clearly, Trump has the opposite as his motto. Speak loudly, speak much, and frantically wave your diminished stick. For this is what he has been doing. Naturally, the world is trying to pass through what his threats really mean. Let me remind us that the US cannot simply, quote, adjust to multipolar realities, end of quote, because the multipolarity is a direct reaction to all the evil and slaughters committed under the US flag. If they want to become a normal, ordinary partner in the multipolar world, they will have to make some soul searching and express remorse for all the states they have democratized is in quotes, by bombs and, quote, colored revolutions, end of quote. Otherwise, the global majority would still look at them as a rogue state, a failed state, to quote Chomsky. Trump is still surrounded by hawks, including Rubio, of course. He wants to spread peace on earth by one hand while preparing for ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians on the other. He wants to extort money from his poorer allies, Macedonia included, while talking about cooperation. All we can hope for is that he will soon fail and will eventually shoot his own leg. Chris Hedges is so far one of the few American intellectuals who see that Trump is not a savior and that the working class should start organizing for a change not of a president, but of a rotten and militaristic system. By now, you got my point, says Professor Biljana Vankovska. I'm afraid I see no reason for optimism. Even the remaining, not quoted part of Rubio's interview was exactly in the line of America's exceptionalism and the megalomaniac plans of his boss. The interview in its totality could be read as Orwellian doublespeak, or as Radhika Desai put it recently in a webinar, instead of speaking softly and bearing a hard stick, Trump is hitting hard with his speeches at the same time while waving with his stick. The threats to bring Putin to his reason, for instance. Under such circumstances, we have to deal with a, quote, wild card, end of quote, all the time during the next 4 years. This is the case, of course, only if we attach so much influence to the personality of Trump and his loyalists. The old/new US president is hardly aware that the world has dramatically changed since his first mandate, let alone since the emergence of BRICS and other multipolarity traits. He's still trying to project his machoistic big stick and believes that others are sheep who would be obedient. But let's be fair. He's not the only US president to be drunk out of the greatness of his state and leadership, and this detached from reality. Even if Trump believes he can navigate the emerging political multipolarity, he remains a bully when it comes to economic multipolarity. His understanding of global affairs is akin to that of a poorly informed student. He once mistakenly included Spain in the BRICS countries and threatened to impose tariffs of up to 100% as punishment. This level of ignorance is hardly surprising, as US empire managers are rarely known for their knowledge, coherence, or competence. Sooner or later, they will face an economic reckoning, just as the Ukraine war is likely to end as another US NATO military debacle. The West whether viewed from Washington or Brussels, remains dangerously delusional. Rubio's rhetoric about the alleged necessity for the US to reclaim its role as a world policeman, as if there were no United Nations or other international organizations, continues the bizarre pattern established by Trump's tweet of Jeffrey Sachs' Cambridge Union speech Q&A, where Netanyahu was labeled as a deep, dark son of a bitch. That same son of a bitch will be the first foreign dignitary to visit Trump in the White House, despite a warrant from the International Court of Justice. Should we expect positive developments or perhaps instructions on how the new bulldozers, not the diplomatic ones, but real ones waiting to clean up Gaza, will be used? Let's not fall for false optimism. We must brace ourselves for Trump 2.0, who will remain unrestrained by international law or any goodwill to leave behind a positive legacy. Instead, he is more likely to embody an American Nero. Occasionally, I have to admit, we might be puzzled by some of his moves and interviews, but don't forget to ask yourself a simple question. Has the US ever assumed responsibility for anything other than its own self-interest? Why is there no Willy Brandt in America? The notion that the US sought to foster global governance for the good of the world is simply self-serving hypocrisy. In the Balkans, we have an old saying, a wolf changes its fur, but never its temper. The English equivalent is a leopard cannot change its spots. Aptly captures US intransigence. Until America confronts its legacy of violence and exceptionalism, optimism is not just premature, it's complicity. That was the feature article titled Rubio's Reasoning as a Reason for Optimism. A leopard cannot change its spots, written by Professor Biljana Vankovska, who, by the way, in the last elections in the Republic of Macedonia, was a candidate for the presidency. Thank you for your attention today. I hope you'll be able to join me next time in another video. This has been Silvana Pavlovska and In Focus with Silvana Pavlovska. Once again, thank you to Professor Vankovska for her permission to broadcast this feature article. Bye for now.